It's a Heidelminicast. And now, Scott Clark.
You've got questions, we have answers. And Josh texts the Heidelcast to ask Dr. Clark, do you consider professional sports to be a legitimate vocation? What are some parameters for thinking through the issue of legitimate versus illegitimate vocations? Great question, Josh, and I'll answer in just a second.
If the Heidelcast helps you, won't you help us keep it going? Please make the coffer clink by clicking on the PayPal link or by sending a check to Heidelberg Reformation Association, 1637 East Valley Parkway, number 391, Escondido, California, 92027.
In order to answer this question well, we have to define our terms, and the first thing we need to define is this term vocation. It's a Latin word, vocatio. It means call. And so a vocation is a call from God to the Christian to do something in this world. How you determine what your vocation is and then begin to fulfill your vocation, that's another topic. But the Reformation was a rediscovery of the vocation of every Christian. It came to be during the Middle Ages, particularly people tended to talk about vocation only or primarily in terms of an ecclesiastical vocation or a vocation to the monastery or a vocation to the priesthood, something like that. And in the Reformation, we said, no, all Christians have a vocation from God. Well, how do you determine your vocation? And so we said secular vocations are good vocations. It's not the case that an ecclesiastical vocation or a vocation to the priesthood is good and then everything else is dirty. No, as long as you have an honorable vocation, doing something that's legal, something that's of value, useful, that sort of thing, those are honorable and good and from the Lord. How do you determine what your vocation is? Well, you look at your circumstances, your opportunities, your abilities, your interest. You pray for wisdom. You seek guidance from people who have experience and wisdom. And you make the best decision that you can. That's about as close as I can get to explaining how to find and fulfill your vocation in the time that we have in the Heidelcast. So, to get to Josh's question, first, do I consider professional sports to be legitimate vocations? And the answer is yes and no. In theory, yes. It would be a legitimate vocation, assuming that you could do it without violating the moral law of God. And the obvious challenge here is that increasingly both amateur and professional sports are being played on the Sabbath, on the Christian Sabbath, on the Lord's Day, and oftentimes in direct competition to public worship. So that is just a very real problem that has to be confronted. You've got 6 days in which to pursue athletic excellence, to work on your athletic gifts and abilities and skills. And if you can make a living at that, without violating the Christian Sabbath, without absenting yourself from the due use of ordinary means, then great. I'm not sure that's possible anymore. Even, as I say, youth sports, traveling teams, the elite teams, all those sorts of things, they all seem to require you to be playing dozens and dozens of games every year and practicing and competing on the Sabbath. By the way, in this regard, if you haven't seen Chariots of Fire, I think you should try to do that. And while we're talking here, I just grabbed my phone and looked at IMDb to see where you could do that, and it's available on Prime Video for $2.99. You can stream it, and if you want to look at it on DVD or Blu-ray or something, you can search for those on Amazon, and you can own your own copy. That came out in 1981. I went to the theater to see that, and the music, it obviously sounds very dated now, because it is dated now, but at the time it was kind of cool. But it's a story of a runner from Scotland who's very gifted and goes to the Olympics, and I won't spoil it for you, but he faces a challenge relative to the Sabbath, and very encouraging, and I highly recommend that. So theoretically, as long as you don't have to be an idolater, an abuser of the Lord's name, a murderer, a thief, in other words, a coveter, or defier of authorities, those kinds of things. So, I mean, there are certain vocations that you can't pursue in this world. A criminal vocation, that would obviously be outside the realm of permitted possibilities. That would be immoral. You can't be a professional thief. That's not a vocation you can pursue legitimately. So, but within the scope of the moral law, and there's no reason why intrinsically professional sports would require you to be an adulterer, sexually immoral, or whatever, then you could do that. But as I say, I think the Sabbath would be a huge problem. Now, as a practical matter, I think idolatry of athletic success in our culture is a real challenge. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't be a Christian and a professional athlete, but the way that athletes are regarded is a challenge, and also the demands that are made on athletes to be successful, and putting athletic success ahead of everything. And I know a little bit about that from the sidelines. I was once upon a time a marginal basketball player, and loved athletics, and had things gone a little differently for me, I could easily have ended up, being a coach, something like that. And so I have some idea from in a rudimentary way, the pressures that an athlete faces to be successful and to compete at the highest level, and to put athletic success in front of everything. And when I was a kid, all I wanted to do was play basketball. And from a certain age, probably third, fourth grade, until my sophomore year in high school, end of my sophomore year in high school, my priorities began to change, because Dave Mumgard stepped on both my feet at the same time in the last practice before the first game of my sophomore year, and I landed on my tailbone. So mostly I sat at the end of the bench that year, praying that the coach would not put me in.
This is the Heidelcast. Text the Heidelcast at any time at 760-618-1563. Heidelcast.
And after that, I got interested in other things, and in a few years, I was starting to think more about ministry. But at any rate, I did see some of that, and done enough reading in the history of sports that I have some idea of the demands that are made on athletes. So those are real challenges that have to be faced. But as to the broader question, which I tried to address a little bit, is you're thinking about legitimate versus illegitimate vocations. You want to ask yourself, first of all, as I said, is it within the scope of the moral law? Is it permitted by the moral law? Does it accord with nature? Or in other words, if you're pursuing a vocation that puts you in direct conflict with the laws of nature, that would be worth considering. And then, am I gifted in this area? Realistically, and this is where you have to seek counsel. It's important to find out, what your actual gifts and abilities are. You may have the desire, and one of the reasons I didn't end up playing basketball any farther than I did was because I was never going to, get much over 6 feet tall. Another 4 inches, maybe I could have played D3 or something, but that didn't happen. So that's a natural limitation. As it turns out, being a slow white guy, there just wasn't much future in college basketball for a guy like me. So that's a natural limitation that limited what I could do. I had to face that. Over time, I figured out that I could, if I worked at it really, really diligently, I could do academic things, even though earlier on I was a very, very marginal student, 250th out of 500 students in my senior year. I did think that I had some intrinsic ability, but because of the educational system in which I was raised, I would never really learn how to capitalize on whatever native abilities I had. But over time, I did figure that out, and then was able to pursue that. And then I obviously had a fairly strong sense of vocation, a sense of calling, both internally, that was confirmed externally by the church. And that's how I ended up in pastoral ministry, which is really what I intended to do coming out of seminary. I really had given up on any idea of pursuing an academic vocation, and it was really kind of an accident in the providence of God, speaking humanly, that I ever ended up going to grad school, getting a DPhil, and then teaching. One thing just sort of led to another, one opportunity led to another, and here I am. There was no grand plan. So there are a lot of things that go into figuring out what you should do with your life. And for me, obviously, prayer is very important, asking for insight into your own gifts and abilities, but also consulting with other people and getting their honest feedback. Yes, I think you can do this. Well, no, brother, honestly, this is probably not a path you should pursue. You should think about this. So that honest self-assessment and getting honest feedback from other people whom you trust, those are the kinds of things that you want to take into account when you're figuring out your vocation.
Thanks for listening. Tune in tomorrow for more from the Heidelcast, brought to you by Heidelberg Reformation Association.org. Don't forget, when the coin in the coffer clinks, the cost of bandwidth shrinks. Copyright Heidelberg Reformation Association. All rights reserved. This is a Heidelminicast.